My brother said he would never betray family. But when our father died, he forged the will and took all the inheritance. He thought I would just accept it. He didn't know I could play the long game. The weight of the coffin seemed lighter than it should have been. Maybe it was because there were 6 of us carrying it, or maybe it was because nothing felt real anymore. My father, the pillar of our family, the man who built an empire from nothing but grease-stained hands and determination, was gone. As we lowered him into the ground, I caught my brother Tom's eye across the polished mahogany. His expression was appropriately solemn, but something flickered beneath the surface, something I couldn't quite read. I should have paid more attention to that look. Growing up in Sacramento, Dad's auto repair shops were our entire world. Every summer from when I was 12, I worked alongside him, learning every aspect of the business. Tom preferred the office, the paperwork, the legal side of things. 2 sides of the same coin, Dad would say with pride. That's why you boys will make perfect partners. The first shop had been little more than a rundown garage in a forgotten corner of the city. But Dad had a vision. He understood that trust was everything in this business. People don't just give you their cars, he'd say, wiping his hands on his perpetually oil-stained rag. They give you their safety, their freedom, their peace of mind. Never forget that, Marcus. By the time I graduated high school, Miller's Auto Care had grown to 3 locations. When Tom finished law school 7 years later, we had 12 shops across Northern California, a training program that other businesses tried to poach our graduates from, and a reputation that made our name synonymous with reliability. Family is everything, Dad would remind us at every Sunday dinner. Even after Mom passed, we kept the tradition. The 3 of us would sit around the old oak table, eating pot roast or lasagna, talking about the business, our lives, our plans. Tom would bring up expansion opportunities, I'd talk about new diagnostic equipment or training programs we should implement, and Dad would listen, pride evident in his eyes. The last of these dinners was 3 months before the cancer took him. He'd been feeling tired lately, but none of us knew why. That night, he was more serious than usual. Boys, he said, setting down his fork, I need you to understand something. Everything I've built, it's for both of you. Equal shares, equal responsibility. You each bring something different to the table, and that's what will make this work. Tom nodded, reaching across to squeeze Dad's shoulder. We know, Dad. Don't worry about anything. Marcus and I will take care of everything, just like you taught us. I remember thinking how perfect that moment was, my father, my brother, our future all laid out before us like a well-planned road. What a fool I was. The reading of the will was scheduled for a week after the funeral. I arrived early at Davidson & Associates, the law firm that had handled our family's legal affairs for decades. The office hadn't changed since I was a kid, same dark wood paneling, same leather chairs that creaked when you sat in them, same smell of coffee and old paper. Tom arrived exactly on time, wearing one of his expensive suits, his silver Rolex catching the light as he shook hands with Richard Davidson, the family's longtime attorney. I noticed Tom had lost weight in the past few weeks, stress, I assumed. We all had. Marcus, he said, giving me a brief hug. How are you holding up? As well as can be expected, I replied, studying his face. There was something different about him today, an energy, a subtle tension in his shoulders that seemed at odds with the somber occasion. Richard cleared his throat, gesturing for us to take our seats. Shall we begin? He pulled out a thick envelope from his briefcase, breaking the seal with careful precision. The paper whispered against his fingers as he unfolded the document. I expected to hear the words we'd all known were coming. Equal shares. Equal responsibility. Instead, Richard's voice seemed to come from very far away as he read. I, James Miller, being of sound mind and body, do hereby bequeath all my worldly possessions, including but not limited to Miller's Auto Care and all associated businesses, properties, and accounts, to my son, Thomas James Miller. The words hit me like physical blows. Properties. Accounts. All of it, to Tom. My name wasn't mentioned at all. There must be some mistake, I said, my voice sounding strange in my own ears. Dad told us both, just months ago, he wanted us to share everything equally. Richard looked uncomfortable, shuffling the papers. I'm afraid this is the final version of the will, dated just 6 weeks ago. It's properly witnessed and notarized. I turned to Tom, expecting to see him equally shocked, equally confused. But what I saw instead made my blood run cold. He was perfectly still, his expression carefully neutral, but there was something in his eyes, satisfaction. Tom. I said quietly. Did you know about this? He spread his hands in a gesture of helplessness that I'd seen him use in court. Dad was worried about the business, Marcus. He'd been watching how you handled things, and, well, he had concerns. You know how impulsive you can be with decisions. Remember that time you wanted to expand into custom modifications without proper market research? That was 3 years ago, and the market research proved me right, I said, my voice growing harder. We doubled our revenue in that sector. After I restructured the program, Tom countered smoothly. Look, I know this is a shock, but Dad made his choice. He wanted to ensure the business's stability. I stood up so quickly my chair scraped against the hardwood floor. Dad would never do this. He believed in us working together. He told us that every single. He told us a lot of things, Tom interrupted, his voice taking on an edge of condescension that I'd never heard before. But in the end, he made a rational business decision. I'm sorry you're upset, but that's how it is. I looked at Richard, who was deliberately avoiding my gaze. When exactly was this will signed? October 15th, Richard replied, checking the document. October 15th, Dad had been in the hospital then, heavily medicated for pain. I remembered visiting him that day, he'd barely been conscious. The realization hit me like a physical blow. I looked at my brother, my own flesh and blood, and for the first time in my life, I saw him clearly. The careful manipulation, the years of subtle undermining, the way he positioned himself as the responsible one while painting me as impulsive and unreliable. It had all been leading to this moment. You forged it, I said quietly. You waited until he was too weak to know what was happening, and you forged his signature. Tom's face hardened. That's a serious accusation, Marcus. Be very careful what you say next. Remember, I'm still a lawyer, even if I haven't practiced in a few years. I looked at him for a long moment, seeing the brother I'd grown up with, the man who'd stood beside me at my wedding, the uncle who'd played with my kids at family barbecues. All of it had been a mask, I realized. A perfect performance by someone who'd been planning this betrayal for years. I could have exploded. Could have lunged across the desk and shown him exactly what I thought of his betrayal. Instead, I remembered something Dad had taught me years ago, when dealing with a particularly difficult supplier who tried to cheat us. Sometimes, Dad had said, the best revenge isn't throwing a punch. It's making them think they've won, then watching them destroy themselves with their own greed. So I stood up slowly, my chair scraping against the hardwood floor. Congratulations, Tom. You got what you wanted. I hope it was worth it. His smile faltered slightly, he'd expected a fight, was prepared for one. My calm acceptance threw him off balance, if only for a moment. I walked out of Davidson and Associates that day with nothing but my name and my memories. But I had something else too, knowledge. Knowledge of every weakness in the business my father had built, every pressure point that could be squeezed, every loose thread that could be pulled to make it all unravel. Over the next few weeks, I watched from a distance as Tom took control. He moved into Dad's old office, replaced the worn leather chair with something modern and chrome. He hired new managers, young hotshots fresh out of business school who didn't know a carburetor from a catalytic converter. I got an apartment in Midtown, small but functional. Every morning, I'd wake up early, make coffee, and plan. I started making calls to old friends in the industry, casual conversations that revealed interesting tidbits about Tom's new management style. He was taking risks, big ones. The kind of risks that make sense on paper but show a fundamental misunderstanding of how the auto repair business really works. He'd taken out loans against the business's assets, using the money to fund rapid expansion. 5 new locations in 3 months, each one staffed with inexperienced technicians who worked cheap. I knew what would happen next. Dad had seen it 100 times, shops that grew too fast, tried to do too much with too little experience. They'd make mistakes. Small ones at first, but in our business, small mistakes had a way of becoming big problems. What Tom never understood was that Dad's success wasn't just about the number of shops or the profit margins. It was about relationships. With customers, with employees, with suppliers. Trust built over decades of honest work and fair dealing. I spent my days reconnecting with those relationships. Coffee with Jake Martinez, our best master mechanic. Lunch with Sarah Chen, who'd managed our parts inventory for 15 years. Drinks with Mike O'Malley, whose family-owned parts supply business had worked exclusively with us since before I was born. I didn't have to say much. They'd all seen the changes Tom was making. They'd all heard rumors about how Dad's will had changed so suddenly at the end. I just listened, nodded, and occasionally asked innocent questions about how things were going under the new management. Meanwhile, Tom was flying high. He bought a new house in East Sacramento, one of those modern monstrosities that looked like it belonged in a different city entirely. He started showing up in local business magazines, talking about his vision for modernizing the family business. He even hired a PR firm to rebrand the shops, replacing Dad's simple, trusted logo with something sleek and corporate. What he didn't notice was how the foundation was starting to crack. Experienced technicians were quietly updating their resumes. Long-time customers were starting to complain about declining service quality. The Better Business Bureau ratings were slipping, just a fraction of a point each month, but enough to show a trend. Then came the moment I'd been waiting for. Tom had leveraged the business to its breaking point, using its stellar credit history, the one Dad had built over 30 years, to secure massive loans. He was betting everything on aggressive expansion, convinced that volume would make up for any drop in quality. That's when I made my move. I hadn't been idle during those months of watching and waiting. I'd been building something of my own, a new auto repair business, but with a twist. Instead of competing directly with Tom, I'd focused on specializing in hybrid and electric vehicles, a growing market that Dad had been interested in before he got sick. I called it Miller Legacy Auto Care. The name was deliberate. Every time someone Googled our family's business, they'd see both companies. And they'd start asking questions about why there were 2 Miller auto repair businesses in Sacramento. I opened my first shop with a core team of familiar faces, Jake Martinez as head mechanic, Sarah Chen running operations, and half a dozen other experienced technicians who'd quit Tom's shops over the past few months. We didn't need to advertise much. Word of mouth in the auto repair business travels fast, especially when people start comparing the service they used to get with what they're getting now. Tom's first inkling that something was wrong came when his quarterly numbers showed a 30% drop in revenue. He blamed the economy, the weather, his new managers, everyone but himself. He tried to stop the bleeding by cutting costs, which only made things worse. He reduced staff training, switched to cheaper parts suppliers, pushed his technicians to work faster rather than better. Then the mistakes started happening. A brake job done wrong. An engine diagnostic missed. Nothing catastrophic, my old friends still working in Tom's shops made sure of that, but enough to damage the business's reputation. Social media reviews started piling up. Local news did a story about the decline of a Sacramento institution. The bank started getting nervous. Tom had used the business's assets as collateral for his expansion loans, betting that growth would outpace the debt. But with revenues falling and costs rising, the math wasn't working anymore. I watched it all from my new office, which I'd deliberately kept simple and functional, just like Dad's had been. Every week, more of Tom's customers would find their way to my shop. I made sure they got the kind of service Dad had always insisted on, honest, thorough, and fairly priced. The final blow came from an unexpected direction. Mike O'Malley, our old parts supplier, had been doing business with a handshake for decades. Tom had tried to strong-arm him into lower prices, threatening to switch to cheaper suppliers. Mike had seemed to give in, but he hadn't forgotten. When he heard rumors about Tom's financial troubles, he decided to require payment up front for all parts. Other suppliers followed suit. Suddenly, Tom's cash flow problem became a crisis. He couldn't stock his shops properly, couldn't pay his staff on time, couldn't keep up with his loan payments. The house of cards he'd built was starting to collapse. I was in my shop late one evening, going over some paperwork, when my phone rang. It was Tom's number. I let it ring 3 times before answering. "You son of a bitch," he said, his voice trembling with rage. "You planned this. All of it." "Planned what?" I asked mildly. "I'm just running my business, Tom. The way Dad taught us to. You turned them against me. The staff, the suppliers, everyone. You've been sabotaging me from the start." I leaned back in my chair, looking at the framed photo on my wall, Dad standing in front of his first shop, young and proud and honest. "No, Tom. You did this to yourself. The moment you decided to steal what should have been ours to share. You have no idea what you've done," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "The banks are calling in the loans. All of them. They're going to take everything. Like you took everything from me." The words came out before I could stop them, and I was surprised by the bitterness still there, buried under all my careful planning. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. When Tom spoke again, his voice had changed. The anger was gone, replaced by something else, defeat, maybe, or recognition. "I really thought I could make it work," he said quietly. "Make it bigger than Dad ever dreamed. Show everyone that I could do more than just handle the paperwork." For a moment, I saw us as kids again, Tom always trying to prove himself, always living in the shadow of my easy rapport with Dad and the business. But the moment passed quickly. "You could have done it honestly," I said. "We could have done it together. Would you consider?" He started, then stopped. "Never mind. I know better than to ask for help now." I looked at the clock on my wall, 9:47 p.m. Outside my office window, Sacramento's lights twinkled in the darkness, unchanging and indifferent to our family drama. "The banks will take control of the business tomorrow," Tom said finally. "They're already talking to potential buyers. I thought you should know." After he hung up, I sat in my office for a long time, thinking about family, betrayal, and revenge. I'd won, technically. My new business was thriving, built on the principles Dad had taught us. Tom had lost everything, the business, his reputation, probably that fancy house too. But victory felt hollow somehow. Maybe because I knew that somewhere in this city, Dad's original shop, the one he'd built with his own hands, would soon belong to strangers. Or maybe because despite everything, Tom was still my brother, and part of me wished things could have been different. 3 days later, I read in the local business journal that Miller's Auto Care, the original business, was being sold at auction. The article mentioned how the once proud Sacramento institution had fallen victim to aggressive expansion and mismanagement. I made some calls, spoke to some investors I knew. By the end of the week, I had the financing lined up to buy back Dad's original shop. Not the whole chain, I didn't want that. Just the first location, where it all began. The morning of the auction, I arrived early. Tom was there too, standing at the back of the room, looking older than I'd ever seen him. Our eyes met briefly, but neither of us spoke. I won the bid for the original shop. As I was signing the paperwork, my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Dad would be proud of you. At least one of us kept his legacy alive." I didn't respond. Instead, I drove to the shop, my shop now, and parked in the same spot where Dad used to park every morning. The sign still said, "Miller's Auto Care," though it was faded and needed repainting. Standing there, key in hand, I thought about legacies. About how sometimes you have to lose everything to understand what matters. About how revenge, even when served cold and calculated, leaves a bitter aftertaste. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The smell was the same: oil, metal, rubber, honest work. On the wall hung a photo I hadn't seen in years: Dad, Tom, and me, arms around each other, smiling in front of this very building. I took the picture down, but couldn't bring myself to throw it away. Instead, I put it in my desk drawer. A reminder, maybe, of what we'd had, what we'd lost, and what might still be possible someday. The next morning, I opened the shop for business. The sign still needed repainting, and I had decisions to make about that. Keep the old name. Merge it with Miller Legacy. For now, though, I just turned on the lights and got to work. After all, that's what Dad would have done.